Now, let me start with you, Justin, just because you made that smart comment.
Thanks.
Tell us about AgriWeb. What is it? What are you trying to do? How does it help, hinder, enable greater transparency, better data on farm? What are you trying to do?
Well, thanks very much, Craig, and thank you very much both to the sponsors and AmCham for having us. It's a real honour to be able to speak to you guys, so much appreciated, and most particularly, happy Thanksgiving to everyone. So AgriWeb is an ag tech business, and hopefully, like a lot of ag tech businesses, it was founded from a very personal problem. My family, despite sounding like a POM, my family comes from 5 generations of livestock farming from Quilpie and Western Victoria and the Riverina. And when I went back to the farm, and I didn't grow up there, I'm more of a math geek, and I couldn't believe we were making these decisions based off of anecdote and how it worked on Fred's farm next door, rather than data and benchmarking and forward testing. So we ended up building this business effectively to digitize on-farm records. And why that's so important for the topic today about paddock to plate is, as we've grown, we've realized that digitizing on-farm data enables traceability. It enables prediction in supply chain. It enables the farmer themselves to run much more efficient operations. And the uptake has been so exciting. And clearly, it's a problem that was shared not only from our kitchen table in Victoria, but we've grown in the past 4 years that 1 in 5, or 20% of all the livestock in Australia is actually raised on AgriWeb. And not just here, but it's a great story of exporting an Aussie technology and a solution to an Aussie problem, where we've got similar market coverage in the UK. We're rolling out in Brazil, South Africa, and the United States. And one of the examples, which I'm sure that Thomas Foods will highlight with an exciting announcement, but is in the UK, we've been able to work with Tesco and Sainsbury's and the processors over there to be able to look at the full traceability of the animal. So you're able to finally know where your meat came from, what antibiotics it was treated with, what is the origin and the health and the husbandry of what happened to that product. So I think it's an incredibly exciting sort of stage that we're at for paddock to plate and traceability. But ultimately, I also have a deep belief that it's got to be grounded at the point of origin, meaning it has to be a technology that helps the producer. It has to help the farmer.
And David, so you're the Chief Operating Officer for this conglomerate that is Thomas Foods International, with significant operations in other parts of the world, including the United States, yes, in New Jersey. Tell me about this Thomas Family Guarantee. What is this?
Well, firstly, we're not a conglomerate. We're a family company. We're third largest by size in Australia, but it's Australia's largest family-owned meat processing business, and we export in about 80 countries, and we're quite proud of that. And we've had, talk about conglomerate or size, we've grown quite quickly, the last 10 to 12 years especially, but we've grown in major markets. And if you look across our industry, so to speak, it's just 3 compartments. It's the buy, the make, and the sell. So on the buy side, with the Thomas Family Guarantee, we're looking closer to the producer to get that alliance, but that alliance supports the opportunity to tell the consumer at the back end, the sales end, the provenance, the security, and the history of that animal. So having that relationship with the producer and having that guarantee through the commencement of the process is pretty important for us.
Yeah. And Paula, so we've grown the product, we've processed it, and we've commenced a marketing process. Yeah. From your field of expertise, you're really focused on geographical indicators.
Yeah, so a geographical indicator is an indicator that promotes that there's a connection between food and origin, and it's normally because there's a reputation, a quality or characteristic that you can tie back with the food to its origin. And it's really important for transparency of origin to have a food GI framework. It's a legal framework that essentially shows that connection between food and origin has been regulated before a regional name is used on a food label to make an origin claim.
So I want to drill down to things
Yeah.
that have come across in that 3 introductory areas, but let's start with this. And so I'd like to be able to understand what is the game that's being played here.
Okay.
And so people will have heard the reports and seen stories about obviously the champagnes
Yeah.
and the wine stuff is pretty well known, or
Yeah.
the fights that have broken out are well known.
Yeah.
It's stemming into other food categories or products or
Yeah.
attributes or regions. And so what is the tension that's going on there, and what is the game, and what's being
Sure.
put forward as different stakes?
Sure.
And
There's a few different levels. So the game at a national level for Australian regional food producers is really having a framework that provides them incentives to keep investing in regionally branded food products. So at the moment, unfortunately, due to deficiencies with laws that dabble in this area, and they're mainly consumer protection laws, trademark laws and passing off, you can get regionally branded food products. And when I say regionally branded food products, I mean food products that include regional names such as Barossa Valley on a food label making an origin claim. I think most of us as consumers, if we see a food product in our supermarket that's got Barossa on it, we assume there's some connection between that food product and the Barossa. Unfortunately, though, that's not always the case, and that's because there's deficiencies in current laws that allow regional branding to be used on food labels that just fall short of being misleading or deceiving. And normally you can just fall short of being misleading or deceiving because somewhere else on the food product, normally on the back label, there's actual place of production that's being disclosed. So if this continues to happen, it's a disincentive for regional food producers to invest time and money in making authentic regional food products using locally sourced ingredients, maybe processes and methods that are quite unique to an area, thereby building on the value in a name such as Barossa. If someone else, another food producer, can use Barossa as well on a food product that clearly has no connection with the name region, particularly if it's an overseas competitor that is very remote from the region as well.
what about, it gets really murky though, right?
Yeah.
So what about, I was at an event a couple of weeks ago with Hugh Killian from AACO, and they talk about the story of the the Darling Downs Wagyu and the branding that's gone around that, and the channel into South Korea and other markets, but
Sure.
particularly into South Korea.
Yeah.
Just look at the name for a second.
Yeah.
Darling Downs Wagyu.
Yeah.
And if you haven't learned anything before you leave tonight, here's one thing. Wagyu, translated from Japanese, means our beef. So it strikes me as interesting that we've got a geographical indicator there called the Darling Downs, and yet we're using a Japanese translated word that stands for our beef.
And so there's another layer to it, which is, has Wagyu perhaps become a common generic name, and therefore it is available for others to use? And the Darling Down, could that be an Australian GI that's protected pursuant to a GI framework that would then stop competitors from using Darling Down if they don't fall within that particular GI area? So that's kind of the national game. Then at an international level, as you were saying before, it's a game as well, in the sense that obviously we're in the context of a free trade agreement negotiation with Europe, which started back in July last year. We're coming up to the 6th round of negotiations in a couple of weeks in Brussels, and the Europeans have requested a certain list of food names and spirit names, but I'll just focus on food names. There's about 236 names on the list that they would like protected as geographical indications. Why as geographical indications? Because geographical indications are badges of origin of food, of where it originates from. They provide a high level of protection. If someone else tries to use a name that is a protected GI, it allows for automatic rights against the usage of that name. So it gives a higher level protection than a trademark does. So that's why they're looking for that higher level protection as a GI. Some of the names on the list are contentious. For example, feta raises similar issues as your Darling Down Wagyu example. Has feta perhaps become a common generic name? Is it something that food producers have used for several years now to describe a style of cheese? why should just the Europeans be able to use that as a GI? Why can't Australian cheese producers continue to use it? So from the European perspective, they'll say, well, feta is a GI. In fact, it's not a region in Greece, but it denotes a cluster of about 7 different areas in Greece where you've got breeds of sheep and goat that, given the fauna they eat off of, their milk has a particular quality that is used to make feta. And so their claim is that only they should be allowed to use feta.
And can I ask, what are we claiming in reverse?
So this is an opportunity for Australian regional food producers, Australian food industry, to think about the assets that we have in Australian regional names, such as Barossa, Kangaroo Island, McLaren Vale, and so forth, and ask for those names to also be protected.
What about Barramundi and Manuka?
Good examples. So Barramundi, as an example as well, this would be an opportunity to have that protected as a GI, so that only fish producers, obviously, Barramundi, can use that name on fish that are local to particular waters in Australia, and other areas as well where they're not particularly local.
Sorry.
And then it will cut out competitors, particularly from overseas markets, using Barramundi.
One of the things my dad taught me when I was very young was don't poke the bear, right? Not that we have bears in country New South Wales, but koala bears maybe, but don't poke the bear and pick your fights, right?
Sure.
And so, and maybe this is not relevant to the European negotiations, but I imagine it would be with other either unilateral or some multilateral negotiations. But for example, if we say we want to put Barramundi on the table to say, nah, you can't use it, is it likely that some crazy Scotsman's going to come along and say Angus and Hereford and all these other things, they're off the table?
Well, some of those names, not particularly, but some names are already included in the 236 that have been put forward by the EU. So yes, we have to unravel the list, we have to unravel the names, we have to determine if they are common and generic, because if we look at other free trade examples that Europe has entered into with other trading partners, there have been concessions made on the basis that some of the names the EU has put forward to have protected are actually common and therefore can't be protected as a GI. So it's unravelling the list, definitely.
Now, David, how much does this play into your business in terms of what your message is to your consumers, whether it's domestic or the international markets?
Well, firstly, we're predominantly export, so 80% of our production probably into 70 markets. But our 3 main markets being China, the US, and Europe. When I talked before about the buy, make, and sell, we've done things. People talk innovation in business and they think about robots and automation, that's innovation. Well, Thomas Foods, historically, when we took full ownership of our business, we said on the buy, make and sell, where can we innovate? We talked about the family guarantee, that's an innovation. Through our factories, through our existing factories, and the factories we aim to rebuild shortly up at Murray Bridge, they'll have a lot of innovation in it. But when you talk about in-market innovation, for us, it's assets in market. So, it's great to be here because we don't know sometimes at the senior level in our business whether we're Australian or American because we spend a lot of time between both. But, we've got a facility we built in Swedesborough, New Jersey, about 5 years ago and employs 500 people. And, we're taking our products from this market into that market and we're further processing it. Okay, we're guaranteeing, if you like, the quality of that product because we're touching it all the way through and we can tell the story all the way back. In Europe, we've took a position with Luton Foods. We bought 35% of Luton Foods in the Netherlands. So we've sort of got that position in EU. So we're further processing there in market. So innovation in market for us is a way to protect the quality of our product, but also sell our product and further value add it through in-market innovation.
Okay. Justin, so you were talking earlier about the problem that you were solving, in many respects a personal problem, a family problem, a business problem that you had. And it's come a long way in a relatively short period of time. You might say a long period of time, but relatively short. You've got amazing market penetration. One of the constant frustrations that I hear from the farmer community and other aspects of the supply chain is everybody gets the idea of needing to digitise and as much as possible standardise and replicate and all those good management consulting words. But what about the interoperability of platforms? Because one of the frustrations that I often hear is that, well, this widget doesn't talk to this widget, and that platform doesn't talk to that platform, and I've got to fill out this goddamn form for the NLIS, and blah, 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 blah. How do you see that landscape shifting into the future?
Well, it's an easy question, clearly, right? So, I mean, I think Zuckerberg's testifying to this exact thing in front of Congress. It is an incredibly complex issue, right? To come back to the origin, I think, one, so if I break down the question into what's useful tech and then what do we do about data? What's useful tech, I think, is probably easier. Like we as innovators across the business in any form of innovation simply have to be collaborative, work together, and build open APIs so that the programs talk to each other. And if they don't, it's stupid because we're all going to die an isolated death. And then we're going to die an isolated death because of the exact thing that you just said. People
So
go,
when you say open API for...
It just means that the programs speak to each other.
Yeah.
So, Apple forever has tried to shield its data to prevent you transferring from Apple to Google. But ultimately, people were like, I'm going to transfer. Mm-hmm. And so a bunch of other companies came in that built transferring programs. And that's what will happen. There literally are programs that are coming in to just connect one scale to another app or a satellite sensor to a dashboard. So we have to be sensible about it. And that leads into the segue of, well, what do we do about data, right? Because you're starting to collect this information, and exactly the same information can be used for good and for evil. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm sort of making this joke about the Google, like, don't be evil. It's actually quite tricky not to. Because if you use, say, benchmarking information to feed back to the farmer so that they can make more efficient decisions about bringing the animal so that it arrives at your processing plant in spec, and so that you can have a full traceability to be able to label it, that's great, right? No one in the room is going to argue against that, and you're going to be very happy to share your data and collaborate with your neighbor. But what happens if I take that same data and I give it to NAB, or I give it to an insurance company, and all of a sudden they ratchet up my rates because they've got a benchmark that they can use in real time? Well, I didn't ask to do that. I didn't give you permission. So I think it comes back to the person that inputs that information, and in this case I'm talking about, it's the farmer. The person who inputs that information has to have the rights for whom and to whom that information can be shared. And additionally, it's not fair to just hide behind privacy filters, like on your Facebook. You have to have a conscience and a responsibility to not be evil and genuinely not do it, because there's a fantastic opportunity to innovate and create a very successful series of companies, but just do it with a conscience. And I feel like we've all got a pretty reasonable barometer of what's good and what's not, and so do that innovation and do it with a conscience internally.
And so for people here that maybe aren't as au fait with the technology that's available on farm today, and the data that is already being captured, whether it's with RFID tags and remote sensing modules, a whole bunch of moisture there's a lot of cool stuff out there already. And without naming names, what's a bad story? To bring it to life, what would a bad use of data be that you promise not to do?
Right. Without naming names. So, I'll name names. So, Climate Corp is a pretty good example of what not to do. Climate Corp, for those who don't know, effectively was a weather prediction service. And that's great, right? We all want to know when the rain's coming. And they got incredible penetration across the United States. And they sold out to Bayer for $1 billion, which is great, Bayer and Monsanto. And well done them. But the fact is that they actually started to take that information not just to give prediction about when the weather was coming, i.e. who they were selling to, but they also started to do it for insurance. And they started to therefore say, well, crop insurance is dependent on when the weather's coming. And so the farmer who thought that, oh, great, I've got this great service that's giving me the weather, was also finding out that they were having, insurance companies or Monsanto keep track of what they were sowing in their paddocks, and therefore they were being penalized for it. Look, ultimately, there's a pretty good litmus test for working out evil and not evil, and it's, are you paying for the service? And that, if you're getting your Google email for free, you're being scanned, right? Because they're reading your email so that they can sell you stuff, because you're getting a service for free. But if you are paying for some sort of technology, then you should have right over that information, and therefore it should be protected.
Everyone's full wall.
Because everyone switched off their phone. Google heard me, by the way. I think they switched off mine.
But maybe just shifting to market dynamics, and I understand, David, you've recently just returned from a trip to China.
Yep.
And to varying degrees, and our announcer talked about the African swine fever outbreak, which has really been a burning, smouldering, massive bushfire for a while.
Huge.
Can you just sort of summarise that as best you can in terms of what's happening there, and then the reverberations that we're feeling around the world, and more relevantly
Yeah,
here?
absolutely. Well, firstly, we're not pork processors, we're beef and lamb, but obviously, if you look to China, it's a big producer, so it's probably 50% of the world's pork production comes from China, and they're 50% of the world's consumption. So, big pork producer. The swine fever, which the outbreaks 2018, 2017, what you've seen is reports in the China media, around 30% of the pork population has been decimated. It's a viral disease, has no cure. The mortality rate is around 90%, 90 to 100%, and they'll obviously contract swine fever, and probably within 10 to 14 days the pig dies. So people are likening it to Ebola in humans. So it's a pretty devastating disease, and it's taken hold in every province in China, and now it's sort of moving through Asia. Hasn't got to Australia, so Australia is swine fever free. It's got as close, I believe, as Timor, but it's a big issue. So there's no cure, there's no vaccine, and it's creating a big hole in the pork supply across the world, and obviously food availability or protein consumption in China. So if you think about the price of, I was trying to give a comparison, the price of pork, like the spot price of pork in China, if you go back to 2018, it was probably 16 RMB, and it's now about 44. So if you put that in Australian dollars, probably 3.35 a kilo for pork in China in 2018, and now $9. So they've seen significant rises in the price of pork in China. So what are the Chinese government trying to do? Well, there's no cure. The issue with swine fever, it stays dormant in the soil. It stays dormant even in frozen meat for whatever period. So how are they going to stop the swine fever is a big challenge. It is a significant challenge for China. Their pork reserves are an all-time low. You talk about US and China with all the trade wars that's going on. There's an issue. China were the biggest customer for US soybeans. I think 75% of the pork feed ration is soybeans. So you've seen another 74%, I think, is a reduction in the soybean exports from the US to China. China needs pork. It's through this trade war with the US. I read an article the other day on the USDA website that in September, China purchased 11,000 tonne of pork meat out of the US just in one hit with a 72% tariff. So that just says how much pork they don't have and how much pork they do need. So if you look at that and you talk about ASF and it's all doom and gloom and that's the challenge, well, I think ultimately, when we talk Providence, we talk Australia Inc., we have a premium product. not just a commodity. We have a premium product with beef and with lamb, and we're seeing this as an opportunity to, again, sell that, not only the provenance, but the reliability of our processing systems, and then market that more into China. So China are now opening up access for more beef and more lamb from across the world. I think fish and chicken more so will fill the pork gap immediately, but we're now seeing consumption and obviously demand for Australian and worldwide beef and lamb is on the increase. It's unprecedented.
And so just to focus in on China for a little bit, so so I think year to date, the latest MLA data suggests that across the chilled and frozen beef exports into the China market, we're up 70% on year.
Yes.
Off arguably a relatively low base, right? But it's rapid growth, and across the entire portfolio of beef exports, it sticks out like the proverbial.
Yeah.
How have you found accessing that market and maintaining the promises and the integrity that you would like to have wherever you operate into those markets to those consumers?
Well, it's a big, firstly, talk about our situation, which is unique. On the back of the fire that we had up at Murray Bridge in January 2018, that was a China-listed plant. So the Australian, obviously the Ag Department does not have delegated authority for licensing. They can license your processing plants to every country except for China and Malaysia. So the Chinese, the Malaysians have to come out and visit your factories. They have to inspect and accredit them. Our factory in the Adelaide Hills at Labourthal isn't China accredited. So even now with the consumption and the demand out of China, our factory in Tamworth of New South Wales employs about 1,100 people. They're doing around 66,000 lambs a week there at the moment. I've got that plant doing Saturday shifts day and night, and we're taking stock out of South Australia, out of Victoria, into Tamworth, New South Wales, just to support that accreditation of that China plant. Now, we're working very hard with the federal government. They're doing a good job to try and facilitate more listings. The Chinese authorities have been to Labourthal in 2017, but the trade wars and all those things that are happening, which are out of all of our control, that's sort of quietening. So the Chinese haven't come to Australia to list more plants. They've listed only a select few for chilled and only a certain few for frozen. So there's still a have and have-nots, if you want to put it that way, for China access for meat out of Australia. But for that, look, I think as the empty belly emerges, I think there's more opportunity. There's discussions about supplying more out of Australia. So that's a positive. But we've got to, just not jump into that market. We can't have people who haven't sort of been in that market and don't understand it. We can't have them just go in there and do the wrong thing. So there's a lot of effort. There's a lot of standardisation across our industry to support people who have experience in that market to continue to have greater and more access to it.
And so your experience with the New Jersey facility that you had, that you talk about doing whatever the right term is, secondary or tertiary processing in that market, which extends your ability to control into the market where it's actually being consumed and sold and consumed.
Yes.
How do you see your ability to do that same type of model in the China market?
Well, we've got an office in Shanghai. We're now sort of trading everything through that office. We're working with toll sort of processes, to do more value adding of our products. So it's an evolution. So absolutely, we'll replicate that in China. That's our aim and aspiration. And when you do that, people think, the initial, why are you in that market? Why are you doing it? Well, sometimes when you sell into a market and all the skin we have in the game, you give it to a guy and he's got his investment is a mobile phone, a rent-a-car, and he's getting as much margin. So it's driven on the fact that you can, add more value to your raw material, but it is getting closer to the end consumer. So when you're sitting with a Tesco, or you're sitting with a Walmart, or you're sitting with a big retailer in the US or the UK, you understand what they want. And they might say, well, look, we love that lamb rack from Labourthal in South Australia, and it's got all these pretty colours, but we're just going to take it and slice the chop. So, why you got it in a bag worth $1.50 when you can put it in a bag for 50 cents with no colour? So having those conversations, getting around the table is a very important part of having that in-market asset and further processing, because it's not only, as I said, getting more of a margin or trying to, at the end of the day, we can't put cars or fridges through our factory. We're here for the producer. So we've got to find as much value as we can so we can be competitive for livestock. But just being in market and having the conversations with the people, and whether it's on provenance or integrity, we start to get ahead of the game about what's important to the consumer and guarantee our supply chains.
And so, Paula, I understand that you're a part of advising, helping in the background, working your magic with the European negotiations. And I understand Mr. Birmingham was in China just recently, actually, obviously unrelated, but fighting the good fight for the likes of Thomas and others. What advice do you have to Mr. Birmingham?
So my advice has been the same from day one, to really take this opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive. So thinking about, like I said before, Australian regional names that we use on food products to make origin claims, to protect them as GIs. And that's really important, not just in the context of the free trade agreement negotiations with Europe, but really important for Australia for where we sit, because many of our neighbouring countries are also on the food GI radar, including China. Many of our neighbouring countries have entered into free trade agreements with Europe, and therefore we're already in the position where Australian food producers are running the risk that we won't be able to use certain terms on foods that we export into those countries if our trading partners have agreed to protect them with the EU. And secondly, an example like China as well, being on the food GI radar and implementing a dedicated food GI framework, as have other neighbouring countries around us, such as Singapore and Japan. It's really a lesson for us to have a think about, again, what can we have protected? What should we be looking at that we have value in? And it's also an opportunity for us to think about and recognise that these countries aren't just into clean and green and quality standards and integrity, which are very, very important and we meet fantastically in Australia, but they're more and more looking at provenance of food, paddock to plate experiences, stories behind the food, and they value culture. They value origin, they value stories, and they want a framework that's going to protect their own national GIs at the same level as is provided in their countries, now with trading partners. So I think my advice continues to be to Minister Birmingham that if we don't get on board the food GI radar, we run the risk of losing out on trade deals with our neighbouring countries, let alone what's happening with the EU in context of those negotiations. So it's really important.
So it strikes me as two different arguments. So with the EU, it's let's agree what the rules are. Let's have a fair fight about agreeing what the rules are. And I'm not, from what you've said, I'm not sure if we've put forward what the non-negotiables from Australia's perspective are yet, but crikey Moses, we need to.
Yes.
And
so what's happened there?
If we haven't got as many as they've got, we need to work harder.
So this EU list that's been published, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade have had a submission period where Australian food producers who have, any kind of discrepancies or issues with some of the names that have been put forward have been able to put forward submissions. That's closed a couple of weeks ago. So DFAT's in the process of now going through.
You know what would be a good cross-reference process? Just go through the streets of Canberra and look at all the street names.
Yeah.
They're all Indigenous Australian names, most of them. Manuka. They're everywhere.
Yep.
Cross-check.
And also, we have to think as well, regional food producers are already, for the most part, using regional names in promoting their food products. And so some of the names that have been put forward by the EU as names they'd like to have protected, for regional food producers, they're not too worried about it because they're already promoting their own distinct regional names. They actually don't want to use EU competitor names on their food products. On the other end of the scale, though, for larger food manufacturers, it's more problematic because they want to continue using EU food names. They don't want to relabel their food products. So that's another level of discussion as well.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, so I do want to finish with one heartfelt question. But hearing you speak about that puts fire in my belly about what's happened in the 1960s with the macadamia industry in Australia. And if you don't know, macadamias are native to Australia, and I'm sorry to raise this at the American Chamber meeting, but it was the Americans who took it from our shores and procured it into California and Hawaii, and it's an Indigenous Australian name. Now, that horse has bolted. I'm not suggesting that we have a fight about unrecouped royalties for use of that, because frankly, they probably do it a lot better than we have. But that was native to Australia. And I hope that the same thing doesn't happen for things like, which it increasingly is, finger limes, kakadu plum, and a range of other different, lemon myrtle, barramundi, a whole bunch of other different varietal names that are known and loved and endeared amongst our community here, and we think are of value in international markets, that it'd be nice to be protecting those with the same vigour that our European cousins are.
And also with the same vigour that we protect Australian wine GIs. Let's not forget, we have a wine GI framework that's worked remarkably well, that does give transparency of origin from grape to wine bottle, and the food industry needs to get to the same level. At the moment, the food industry is a step behind provenance, paddock to plate, and transparency of origin of food. So a food GI framework would be a great legal framework to implement to protect names that you've mentioned and countless others.
Yeah. And so to wrap up on this Thanksgiving occasion, I guess, and to give a very quick plug to a new charity, not-for-profit initiative that's been started in recent months called Thankful for Farmers, thankfulforfarmers.com.au, check it out. Matt Moran, Charlie Arnott, Victoria Coffee, a whole bunch of people are getting involved, Vic Smeets, Victor Churchill, a whole bunch of different people. Check it out. It's a great initiative and really reinforces the concept of being thankful for things. David, what are you thankful for?
A lot of things, but we've put the US theme on, just on food. And I think you go back and talk about the lamb industry just quickly. You know, growing up, a lot of us in the room, you know, we had lamb as a staple 3 or 4 days a week, and on a very, very special occasion, you'd have a roast chicken. And that's all swapped around now. And if you look at the sort of the lamb export industry in Australia, it's probably a byproduct of a buoyant wool industry. And now, you know, the wool industry is, you know, the wool's back not where it used to be, but it's come back somewhat. But, you know, for a while, the wool was a byproduct of a buoyant meat industry. So how do we get to that? And I think it is good marketing. It's a targeting, you know, people would say, oh, who in the US actually eats lamb? Well, I think statistically, less than 1% of the protein consumed in the US is lamb. But if it got to 2%, I don't think the world could supply it. So it's about teaching people in the market about the product, consumers, you know, how to cook it and prepare it, and just don't forget, you know, the importance of marketing, but supporting that marketing program with safe food, good provenance, and good products. So for me, for Thanksgiving, it is more lamb and less of the other proteins.
Hear, hear. Mr. Webb?
So that's a strong Sam Kekovich vibe you've got there.
Yeah.
You'll get a gig with the MLA, surely.
You never know.
So thankful. I mean, I think that Australians and Americans, I'm thankful for the autonomy that we have. You know, the United States and Americans generally are probably better at constantly referring to and being very thankful for their freedom, and I think that that's something that's pretty rife in the world at the moment, right? You look at protests in Hong Kong, you look at protests in Europe, you look at some of the troubles in Syria and Turkey and in South America, et cetera, right? It's a very troubling world, and a lot of that is about people feeling threatened for their autonomy and freedom and et cetera. Now, what we've got here is extraordinary. We have the opportunity to do whatever we want, to really build what we want, to export what we want, and moreover, people want what we can do. So I think with that with that opportunity comes extraordinary responsibility, and we've touched on some of the areas where it can go pretty wrong. But what I'm thankful for is the fact that we actually have that opportunity.
Paula?
I'm thankful for Australia's regionality. I'm thankful for the several regions that we have in Australia that produce great, authentic regional food products, and I think we just need to better promote our regionality and have a framework that protects it. Really passionate about origin, culture, regionality and food, and having a framework that protects all those things.
Fantastic. And I'm thankful for all of you. And on that note, thank you very much, everybody. Hopefully that was interesting.